Hello, I'm Mira Selva. This is the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. Welcome to the Global Journalism Seminar. This is our last seminar of the term, and it's an extraordinary note to end on. On January the 6th of this year, which feels like a lifetime away, we watched around the world as hundreds of protesters stormed the US Capitol buildings to prevent the certification of the election results by Congress. Only one news team was inside the building with the protesters, Robert Moore's. His report for ITV News was viewed over 11 million times on Twitter and has been followed up with an ITV documentary, After the Storm, America's Enemy Within. Robert is no stranger to conflict zones. Before working as a Washington correspondent for ITV News, he was their Middle East correspondent for 5 years and spent time producing and reporting from Moscow, Brussels, and Jerusalem before that. His awards include Royal Television Society Journalism Award for his reporting on a year of fighting on the West Bank in 1996, and 2 gold medals at the New York Film and TV Festival for his reporting on the plight of refugees during the Rwandan Civil War. To have taken a correspondent with that kind of experience and put him in the heart of the United States and to have him witness what he witnessed in January is extraordinary and raises all sorts of questions about the future of democracy, the future of media, and where on earth we're going and what we do now. Let's just start with a short video clip to remind us of those extraordinary scenes.
For 4 years, we have witnessed turmoil in America, but nothing quite like this. The pro-Trump crowd fought with the police, trying to break through their lines, intoxicated by the unlikely prospect of reversing America's election outcome. We watched as the standoff continued for at least an hour. Tear gas canisters were fired from the very stage on which Joe Biden will be inaugurated. But for Capitol Hill police officers, this was a losing battle.
This is exactly what was feared, but in no way is this a surprise. It has been fueled by the president's rhetoric, and it's increasingly clear this election has not healed the wounds. It has simply amplified them.
We followed the aggrieved and infuriated Trump supporters as they stormed the building.
I swear to CNN, and they just said these guys.
Through broken windows and doors they had forced open. And for a few heady moments they felt they had won a precious victory. They were now in the very heart of the congressional building.
Of storming Congress itself.
Because they work for us. They don't get to steal it from us. They don't get to tell us we didn't see what we saw.
We respect the law. We were good people. The government did this to us. We were normal, good, law-abiding citizens, and you guys did this to us. We want our country back. We are protesting for our freedom right now. That's the difference.
What's the purpose of storming Congress?
How do I know that?
Robert, this was an extraordinary moment. Thank you so much for joining us today to speak about this. Tell us a little bit about what you were seeing, because you've had a ringside seat in an extraordinary time in both US politics and, frankly, the role of the media and the relationship between media and politics. And I think in many ways it's changed utterly, or if it hasn't changed utterly, it should be changed utterly. Can I ask you a little bit, because I know this is something you were looking at and have written about a great deal, what your thoughts are?
Of course. Well, first of all, good afternoon and good evening wherever you are. And in my case, on the west coast of the United States, it's a good early morning. But as I was just saying to you, actually, one of the few skills we have as foreign correspondents is we're able to operate even at early hours of this morning, and it's sort of 5 a.m. here, so that works well for me. Yeah, thank you for having me on this webinar, on this seminar. Yeah, I think January the 6th tells us a lot, and it tells us a lot not just about the United States and its sort of societal fault lines, but and we'll talk about this, I think, because we all have one thing in common: we're all journalists and interested in the American media landscape. It tells us a great deal about the American media and why it failed on January the 6th. I mean, there are two central allegations against the American media as looking at America through the prism of January the 6th. First of all, did the partisan nature of American cable television news in particular, did it help feed the nature and the causes of the insurrection by hyping up the very partisan split and by dealing in conspiracy theories, notably Fox News? But secondly, why didn't they adequately cover the day itself? And that's something I'm going to talk about briefly now, and then we can pick it up with sort of questions as well. I mean, I've often been teased over the last few months of being the first Briton to sort of invade Congress since the War of 1812, because, almost uniquely and perhaps a little bizarrely, I was the only journalist in the world, at least the only television journalist in the world, who was kind of embedded with the crowd as it went over the threshold of Congress. And look, for me, that was a nice scoop. It was an extraordinary moment. But the more telling question is not why I got the scoop. The question that I'm fascinated by is, where was everybody else? Because remember, I wasn't working in sort of, Africa or remote parts of Asia. This was Washington, DC. This wasn't just the suburbs of Washington, DC. This was the heart of Washington, DC. This is where the most concentrated group of journalists anywhere in the world. And yet I was alone, sort of with the crowd as it stormed Congress. And so for the last few months, I've been kind of asking the question, well, why was that? And I think that the sort of secret to that is to understand the direction that American television news has gone in. And for us, this is, I think, a really important warning, because what has occurred in the landscape of American cable television news is the creation, to an extraordinary extent, of the panel. So if you turn on American television news pretty much at any time of the day or night, you will find a group of people talking at each other about an event, but rarely, and this is my kind of key criticism, rarely are they news gathering. In other words, if you can turn on CNN, the domestic, CNN domestic, or if you turn on MSNBC, or you notably turn on Fox, you're almost certainly going to find a panel angrily debating a subject or an issue or the news of the day. What you're not going to find in the United States, or at least very rarely are you going to find it, are news crews and reporters out in the field news gathering. And that was so true of January the 6th. So the whole day began not with reporters amongst the crowd listening, talking, interviewing. It had people on a panel debating the certification of the presidential election, debating and arguing about the value of having a protest in Washington that day. Nobody was, apart from us and maybe a few other sort of international channels, startlingly few people were actually talking to the would-be insurrectionists. So my big takeaway is I kind of knew that that insurrection was going to happen for hours beforehand, because I was talking to people and they were telling me in the simplest terms, we are going to storm Congress. Our level of outrage is that high. And so the FBI has been rightly criticized for not predicting and anticipating the insurrection. And that was a massive intelligence failure. But the media also failed that day in anticipating and in covering that event. So for me, the real story, is, yes, it was a kind of a scoop for us to cross the threshold with the crowd, but I still have this gnawing question about where was everybody else? And I think it's a really important question, because it goes to the heart of a news gathering failure that mattered then, but it matters even more now. And the American media is still talking to itself, if you like, debating, but not news gathering. And as GB News enters the frame in Britain, which is, overtly a sort of a talking shop, if you like, although they may do some news gathering, and I wouldn't want to prejudge it. It raises fundamental questions about whether, as journalists, we're doing enough news gathering, or whether we're doing too much debating in panels and so on. So, while it's great to talk about it, let's be clear, the heart of our business is news gathering. And that's really kind of the core point that I take away from January the 6th in the media sense. Although we can talk also about the sort of growth of conspiracy theories and the danger that the crowd posed, not from a traditional sense of being heavily armed, but being armed with something perhaps more dangerous than guns, which is these toxic online theories and how they gather their news. That too is a kind of a deeply alarming. So in a way, it's a great time to have a seminar like this, because we've got a few months to have reflected on this. And what we have is a news gathering failure from the most powerful news networks in the world. We've got toxic online news kind of worldviews. We have, the sort of the death of that insurrection, but also concerns about the health of democracy as well. So many questions sort of intersect here. And I'd be delighted, Mira, to take questions from you or from those listening in. They can be about January the 6th, about the media landscape. They can be about the partisan nature of American television news and about the danger that poses in itself to American democracy.
Thank you very much, Robert. Please do type in your questions to the Q&A function and I'll put them to you. I have questions to start with about risk, which is this was a violent crowd that did later also turn on journalists. When you were right in the middle of it, did you get a sense of any impending danger? And if you did you feel a need to remain or leave?
Yeah, good question, Anne. I've been asked that a few times since January the 6th, because it obviously was a violent crowd. And they did turn on the media. And in fact, we passed a few signs saying, kill the media, some sort of graffiti said the same. So I think we were all aware that there was a risk. But, in our business, Mira, I think, certainly I've done this for sort of 30 years as a foreign correspondent, is what we do with risk is we don't ignore it, we don't get intimidated by it, but we calibrate it. So what I'm always looking at is, what's the risk to reward ratio? And there, very clearly, the reward was sky high, because we were seeing in real time a huge story unfold in the seat of the world's most powerful nation. So I could recognize that the reward was very high. It was also notable to me, even in real time, that there were no other television cameras around us. So, although I wasn't clear whether, we had a scoop at that point, in the sense that we were the only television news team in the world with the crowd, that wasn't clear. Nevertheless, I realized it was being massively underreported. So I thought the risk was high. The reward was high. So then it was just a matter of calibrating the risk. I wouldn't do anything if I thought either myself or my team would get killed. I was looking around, didn't seem that many people had firearms. People had a few kind of bizarre sort of spears, flagpoles that had become spears. A few people had baseball bats. So it seemed to me like it was risky. We might get beaten up, we might get attacked physically with fists, but it didn't seem to me that they had the ability to easily, at least, to kill us. So, it wasn't like we were, in a sort of conventional combat zone. So overall, the risk seemed tolerable and the reward seemed immense. So we carried on and got in there, filmed this insurrection basically in real time, spoke to people as they were actually kind of racing through the corridors and passageways of Congress, and managed to extract ourselves in time. It's an interesting point about television, isn't it? Is we have relentless deadlines. So, it would have been fun to have been in there for even longer, but we had to get back to file for News at 10, which goes out at 5 p.m. in the US East Coast. So it meant that we had only like an hour of news gathering time to do that before I needed to get back to my bureau and to edit the report for that night's News at 10. So, everything is done under pressure. There are always compromises. Whether things I would love to have done that day differently, absolutely. I was on the very threshold of Nancy Pelosi's office. I didn't go in because I didn't have time. Subsequently, there was a great photograph of a guy called Richard Bartlett with his feet on the table of the speaker. You know, I would have got that if I had another 20 seconds, but I didn't get that on video because I had to race back. So, you know, what it teaches me is, you know, for all the glamour of television news, we are hopelessly compromised by deadlines and how difficult it is to sometimes achieve things, you know, we wish we could have done. So we just have to recognize that even in our news gathering terms, we're constantly compromised.
Thank you. Going back to the idea of reporting from the mob, because you're absolutely right about calibrating risk, but I think what we have seen in recent years is a change of attitude in many protests, that journalists are now no longer seen as neutral participants, but are seen as part of the problem and very much become targets. I wanted to ask you whether you felt that your status as an outsider, as a non-American, helped or hindered you or made any difference? And then also a question from Jacob Krupa, who's our journalist fellow from Poland, who's saying, you know, how do you talk to people in the middle of a mob that has a mind of its own? So how do they respond to questions? Do you just have to kind of shove the mic and, you know, are there certain questions that work and certain ones that just won't?
Yeah, good, both of the good questions. So thank you for that. I mean, the one on you know, on the fact that we were so international media, it undoubtedly helped. So yes, I was, wherever I saw people looking at us, you know, glaringly with hostility, I would very often sort of make eye contact and make clear that they knew that we were a British TV crew. You know, because we're working with pretty small cameras, so in some ways, you know, it's not clear who we are. We're kind of a mystery to some people because we're working now in this new age of digital sort of field news gathering. We're often working in a way that's not easily distinguishable from video bloggers. So, so that is a risk in itself, is people aren't clear that we're a professional broadcast network. Just from looking at us, that, you know, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, you could see a TV news crew a mile away. Now we could look like activists or, you know, provocateurs or anything. So that is an additional danger. So yes, I was making clear that we were a British crew, thinking that that would help us, you know, somewhat disarm them in the sense that they wouldn't feel that we were part of their particular fight. And the other point about it is that they were also, the crowd was also incredibly preoccupied with its own agenda, which was to try and change the certification of the election. So they had their own mission, and in some ways, they didn't care too much about it. So that allowed us to have what I think was the success of that report. Is it, you know, it was a fly on the wall style report in which we didn't try and intervene too much. We were kind of eyewitnesses to history, and we saw our role in those terms. So, you know, as we asked, I mean, to address that second question, you know, as we saw people running sort of towards the chambers and towards the speaker's office, it struck me that what we needed to achieve was kind of very quick, short interjections to try and capture the kind of the visceral nature of what was unfolding. So, you know, very frequently I was simply asking the question, you know, why have you stormed Congress? You know, a sort of monosyllabic question, why? Why are you doing this? I didn't want to get into great theological or ideological or philosophical debates at that moment when they're rampaging through Congress. So I kept it super simple and asked that question that is, you know, so deceptive to so many people, and it always triggers them, is why? And funnily enough, you know, a lot of people, even in the heat of the moment, as they're doing this extraordinary act, they actually kind of respond really well to the question of why, because they're driven, they have their own sort of motives, and they're perfectly happy to share it. It's no secret what they were doing. And it was, you know, you heard, I think in that clip, you know, when I asked them why, they said, well, because they stole it from us. And they were very keen to explain that they felt that this was, as we heard from that chant in the crypt of the Congress, it was their house, our house, our house. They felt, and this is the key to understanding January the 6th, they felt, and more importantly, they still feel, and I've spoken to many of them in the subsequent months, they still feel that they did nothing wrong, that this was their real estate, this was the people's house, and that they were making their political point. Almost everybody still believes that January the 6th was a legitimate political protest. I've yet to meet an insurrectionist who has expressed to me any regret or remorse about that day. And that's why January the 6th is such an important moment, because you know, it isn't something that was seen in retrospect as a terrible crime against democracy. They feel they were Democrats. They feel they were doing it in the spirit of 1776, that this was kind of a revolutionary fervor, but absolutely in the same spirit as the American Revolution that brought, you know, their birth from the British colony. So, I mean, they have a very strong sense of being right. Even now, you won't find an insurrectionist pleading guilty. You won't find an insurrectionist or a seditionist from January the 6th who is expressing regret or remorse. So, you know, that's a telling moment, really.
That's a really, really interesting point. What do you do with this? Again, as a journalist, you've spoken to them because you were making a documentary, but again, most of the news media aren't making documentaries, so they've moved on from putting those people at the center of the screen, but they are still here, and the ideas they espoused are still very much alive. So do you think journalism has a responsibility to kind of stay on it? Or is the danger of that you're giving visibility to a movement that's died down?
No, I think I believe strongly that the best form of journalism is to shine a light on intolerance, extremism, and conspiracy theories wherever we see them. I don't think we can ignore them because they are being fermented, they are being nurtured, they are being shared online. So the question isn't, you know, if we don't cover it, will that toxic message be absorbed? It is being absorbed. The question is, do we expose the sort of ramifications of this online war that's being waged? Do we try and bring it to television screens and explain the implications of it? And I'm sure we should do, because to an extraordinary extent in America, but also around the world, you know, these conspiracy theories are spreading like wildfire. You know, it's notable, Mira, that you know, of course, January the 6th was based on a conspiracy theory. You know, it goes without saying that the election was stolen, on the November election had been stolen. But it also spawned an entirely new conspiracy theory that actually January the 6th wasn't an attack by the far right, it was an attack by the far left, in order to kind of incriminate the conservative political forces in America. And it, you know, even more than half of all Republicans believe that the January the 6th attack on Congress was an attack by the far left to discredit the right. And that tells you that if we don't confront these theories, they're certainly going to be nurtured anyway. So it seems to me very important that we focus on this, on the dangers of January the 6th. And by that, I mean, I don't mean go down the sort of liberal rabbit hole either, of saying that these are, by definition, domestic terrorists. This was an existential danger to America. I don't actually buy that either. Because what I know about these conspiracy theorists is, yes, some of them were a danger, some of them were white supremacists, some of them had a militia background, but many of them, above all else, were victims themselves. They are delusionists. They truly believed what they were doing was right. And that tells you kind of there's an even more fundamental danger to what happened on January the 6th. It's not that they were domestic terrorists. Many of them were not, but what they were is deeply delusional about the root causes of American sort of, you know, fault lines. So it tells us that, you know, we need to tackle not just, you know, January the 6th, but conspiracy theories, the causes of them, why so many Americans believe these wild theories about what happened on November the 3rd, and indeed in the months and months that have followed it.
That kind of comes to the idea of polarization and ghettoization of news consumption. And you've talked about the kind of the debate, the highly partisan debates on American cable television. Where do you think, you know, would these people who are on Capitol Hill on January the 6th be watching TV anywhere, or is all the information coming online? Like, which stations would they be watching? We've heard a lot about Fox News. Very interested to know whether you actually think there was a line there.
Yes, the answer to that question, and we've looked at it pretty closely, and I've spoken to a lot of people about where they do get their sort of news views and news consumption from, and many of them are watching cable television news. Many of them are migrating across Fox News. You know, that is a big draw for them, particularly, and this is the key point, particularly the opinion programs that start in prime time on Fox News. So anything after like 5 p.m. in the evening, then we get the sort of Sean Hannity's, the Tucker Carlsons, those who are not. You know, I've spoken about the panelization of news, you know, that phrase that talks about how American television news, or at least on cable networks, is overwhelmingly now just a series of panels. That is true, and they become deeply partisan in prime time, both on every network, whether it's CNN and they're berating the crowd as domestic terrorists, whether they are, you know, Fox and sort of extolling the virtues of Donald Trump, or whether it's MSNBC. I mean, everybody in the evening time becomes incredibly partisan on American television cable news. So they're getting it from there. But what they're then doing, what these Trump loyalists and conspiracy theorists are then doing, is taking their news online and sharing it on platforms, whether it's to some extent Twitter, but now it's Parler, before that was taken down, and other much more conspiracy sort of laden sort of chat rooms. So all of that is going on, but it's migrating away. It started with kind of Fox and right-wing talk radio, so it's kind of in that broadcast ecosystem, and then they start sharing much more lurid and more bizarre, ever more bizarre theories on sort of in chat rooms and on private right-wing kind of white conspiracy theorists and militia sort of supporting chat rooms. And so it's just a massive kind of maelstrom of all this stuff, but it begins with cable television news, which is why the partisan nature that you're talking about is so dangerous, because it's fueling it.
What we're also seeing is the kind of idea that there's news and there's opinion is disappearing. So people are just watching cable TV, thinking they're watching news when they're watching opinion. And the media, in a way, has failed in its responsibility to make it clear that one part is news and one part is opinion, because there's an assumption that readers will pick this up, and they don't, and viewers will pick this up.
It's such an important point. I mean, that, you know, and this polarization and partisanship on cable television news, you know, is one of the reasons that nobody reported it properly on January the 6th, but it's also one of the reasons that fueled it in the months before. And, you know, even before we began this webinar, you and I spoke about how, you know, there is a whole section of the American media that misses Donald Trump because he was good for business. And it's a central hypocrisy of our business, in a way, is that we kind of nurtured the forces of Donald Trump. You know, he became president on the back of sort of coverage of his campaign. And then we kind of are surprised that he was elected. I mean, it's kind of the, if you like, the hidden hypocrisy of our business, is that he was great for business. And, you know, he made the careers of many TV reporters and writers and, you know, a whole group of authors out there. Yeah, because
it was very hard to see reporting on Donald Trump that wouldn't be seen as partisan one way or another, you know, kind of a kind of horror.
Yeah, and Mira, let me just add one caveat. It obviously is true that there's been some magnificent journalism in America over the last, you know, 4 or 5 years, from the New York Times and the Washington Post, have done valiant newspaper journalism. My criticism is mainly aimed at sort of the 24-hour cable news channels that I believe failed catastrophically on January the 6th in not being there on the ground, but also, you know, helped to fuel it by what this wildly partisan media landscape.
And that's what the question I wanted to ask, which is from Craig Robertson, one of our researchers, which is about impartial reporting, because the concept of impartiality is up for grabs in many ways and contested, as is objectivity. So how important to you is the idea of impartial reporting, and how should journalists best approach being impartial in their reporting? We have the debate in the UK with the BBC of both sidesism, and the idea that this isn't impartiality, just to air both sides of a debate.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I think what, you know, it's the oldest question in journalism, is there such a thing as kind of an objective reporter? You know, even, you know, looking at my reporting on January the 6th, you know, the whole area of reporting that was actually extremely problematic. Was I right to describe it as a mob? I was, you know, in retrospect, clearly it was a mob. But actually at the time, I was quite cautious about using the word mob, and I didn't use the word mob. I used kind of, you know, a crowd of pro-Trump activists or vocabulary like that, because I was reluctant to even, you know, pass judgment on whether that was a mob. Now, you know, even that was obviously in retrospect kind of wildly too cautious, but I remember doing a podcast the next day in which somebody said, was it a mob? And I said, look, you know, let's see if that was a mob. You know, it's not clear, you know, was it orchestrated? Was it truly kind of spontaneous? You know, I don't know if it was a mob. You know, now I think it's fair to say it clearly was, because you know, it met almost every definition of a sort of wild and unruly crowd, sort of driven to, you know, in pursuit of a political goal, perhaps. So it's right. I mean, you're right to raise questions about our vocabulary, whether there is such a thing as objectivity. Do I come to it? Do all of us come to it with the kind of mainstream judgment that the insurrection was necessarily a bad thing? You know, are we too defensive of democracy, and do we regard it as too precious, or should we be not making a judgment about the seditionists of January the 6th. All those are big questions. I mean, I think what I tried to achieve, and it's no brilliance on my part, but I try and listen. I regard my role as a journalist really as a kind of a listener. So that's why I try to ask simple questions of the people as they sort of march through Congress, to ask that question of why, what are they doing there, what's their motive, what's their grievances. Those are the things I wanted to hear. And then I thought, listeners can process, any analysis for themselves. On the day, it's not possible to analyze the event of January the 6th. And I recognized that. So I thought, well, let's just listen to them. Let's do fly on the wall reporting. Let's take the viewer basically into the corridors of Congress and let them see for themselves what's unfolding, and they can make their own judgment. And I think that's kind of the key to making a report work in real time when you're doing breaking news is, don't patronize the viewer with sort of quick judgments, which almost certainly won't survive the dawn of the next day. And let's just bring the viewer in and let them decide and view things for themselves and make their own judgments. And then they're going to curate it with all the other news media that they consume as well. They're not just watching News at 10, and that's not the end of their kind of news gathering skill set as a viewer. They're reading a newspaper, they're listening to radio, they're chatting to friends, they're listening, so we're just part of the picture for them. And I think on that day, perhaps it was successful because we allowed them just to see for themselves what was unfolding in real time.
You talked about the kind of rabbit holes of misinformation and, online chaos that people fall into, but there's been very little doubt that in many countries, including the United States, a lot of the misinformation has come from the top, from politicians. So question from our director, Professor Rasmus Nielsen, how in your view can journalists best combine, firstly, the commitment to seeking truth and reporting it with the hearing all sides when many major Republicans, including the former president, are spreading false and misleading information about the 2020 election and the January the 6th insurrection, and Liz Cheney being forced out as chair looks like a watershed moment in terms of what the GOP will look like going forward?
Yeah, excellent questions, as you'd expect. I mean, it's a central conundrum, isn't it, of the Trump years, and it's not one that journalism has yet successfully grappled with. I mean, when he was telling lies from the White House podium, was it the obligation of journalists to broadcast that because he was the president of the United States, the most powerful man in the country, the leader of a nation, democratically elected? Was it our duty to broadcast those press conferences, or was CNN right to kind of at some point abandon it and say, look, we are not broadcasting what is, palpably untrue? And I'm not sure there is an easy answer to that. I mean, Twitter struggled with it. Big tech has struggled with it. Broadcast media struggled with it. Newspapers had an easier time because they weren't doing live broadcasting, so they could kind of look at a press conference, analyze it for a few hours, decide, what to write and what not to write. But if you're doing a live broadcast from a presidential press conference and the president himself or some authoritarian leader elsewhere in the world is broadcasting what is either misinformation or even worse, kind of malicious information that is dangerous and toxic, then what is the responsibility of journalists to disseminate that if it comes from from the highest office in the land? And that is not something that we as an industry, I don't think, have successfully grappled with it. And Donald Trump exposed that brutally, through 4 years. I mean, he saw that we couldn't handle live broadcasting, and so that's what he made as his kind of motif, was to try and work around us, knowing that if we had time to curate and to analyze the news, it perhaps wouldn't be favorable for him. So he decided, above all else, to own sort of live broadcast events. And that's why his rallies were mesmerizing, but also pretty dangerous, because he knew he was unedited in that environment.
What kind of conversations were you having with your news desk at the time about this? Was this something you were flagging up that they were concerned about? And were you making decisions differently to your kind of previous, postings?
Yeah, I think we were being definitely more cautious, particularly in sort of live broadcast moments. But what we were trying to do is kind of, it sounds old-fashioned, but it was a successful way of navigating the Trump years, is actually focus less on the sort of Beltway and on Donald Trump and on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and actually report kind of what ordinary Americans were thinking and saying. So, we tried to make it a big part of our reporting to go outside of Washington and go into the Trump heartland to hear people's grievances, but also to see if there were things going on that those inside the Beltway weren't reporting. And actually, the reporting I'm proudest of that we did in the last year or so wasn't on January the 6th at all. It was reporting we did from Louisville in Kentucky in early September of 2020, when we came across militia movements that had been really empowered and took to the streets of American cities in sort of response and in reaction to BLM protests. And it was the first time that I'd realized that there was a powerful and hugely empowered sort of white supremacist and militia driven movement that was waking up in the heartland of America. And another reason that sort of informed our January the 6th coverage was that we'd seen that there was a militia movement that was now much more active politically than it had ever been before. It had come out of the sort of mountains, if you'd like, and was taking over American cities. And that was something that we discovered in Kentucky to a remarkable extent. And it informed our coverage of January the 6th. And it's the reporting I'm proudest of, is to realize that the sense, the sort of the warning signs of January the 6th were not just that on that day, they were out there, if only people had been news gathering. So it brings a little bit our conversation full circle. If only Americans had been properly engaged in, if the American media had been, and television in particular, had been properly engaged in news gathering, January the 6th wouldn't have been a surprise at all, because it was actually in plain sight. I saw it for myself in early September in Kentucky. There were these militias saying we won't accept the fall of Donald Trump. He's our president. And so, all of that fed into January the 6th. And I think that was kind of a sign to me that news gathering is what we do. It's in our DNA, and that's what we must never forget. We can't just sit in a studio and panel and talk in panels. And, the irony of the American television news business, sitting in studios literally within sight and sound of the insurrection, but not leaving the studios to report on it, is a startling warning sign of where the American media has gone wrong.
I'd like to kind of look at this, on a global perspective, because we have several fellows on our journalist program from around the world, including Zoe Ramusha, who's from Zimbabwe, but in the US at the time. So I was looking at this with kind of, multiple perspectives. And she was working on a documentary embedded with a militia group for about 10 months before January, as you said, following these groups in plain sight. But afterwards, most of their characters went underground and essentially disappeared and were very reluctant to speak. She was wondering, what's your experience been, since some of your sources seem to feel they were justified in their actions? Are they still willing to speak and be featured in the media?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question, and well done for your own sort of journalism in tracking and following the militia story, because not many Americans have done that to the degree that it deserved. Look, in the months since January the 6th, as I've mentioned, there's almost no sense of remorse or regret. Look, 450 people or so are facing criminal charges for January the 6th. One person of those 450 has pleaded guilty. The rest are completely convinced that they did nothing wrong. But what has happened is that, and it's a danger for law enforcement, it's perhaps a danger for democracy, is that this sprawling law enforcement investigation that's now been launched into the militia groups has forced them deeper underground. So what you and I perhaps saw investigating militias at the end of 2020 is much more problematic now, because they now realize that we're kind of on their tail, and they are recognizing that law enforcement is trying to sort of break open their ranks. So they are now off the grid. In fact, down in Florida, in one of my documentaries, we spoke to sheriffs who say that there are training camps for kind of far-right militia groups out basically in the swamps of eastern Florida, where people are training, but where there is no good information anymore of what is going on. So in a sense, even though it's much quieter than it was, the drumbeat of sort of the militia movement is much quieter than it was, the moment of peak danger to America may still be ahead. And that's a point I've made in some of my documentaries, is there are still these groups and extremists and militants and militia groups out there. They're still feeling emboldened, but they're now off the grid. And that means we know much less about what they're up to.
That also means they've kind of decided that they don't really want to engage with the media, either by consuming news or appearing in it. Is this a problem?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it is a problem.
And what do you do about it as journalists?
It is a problem. It's a problem for law enforcement. It's a problem for the country, but it's also a problem for us as journalists. You know, how do we report on the sort of white supremacist far right movement that is there? You know, as I've tried to explain, the January the 6th and the insurrectionists who I went back to, you know, because there was a huge interest in what, you know, you went there with these kind of wild-eyed characters. Let's go back and revisit them. And I did that in a couple of documentaries since, and try to understand their worldview, try to understand where they get their news agenda from. You know, why were they so dedicated to the conspiracy theory of the stolen election? Where do they kind of gather their own news from? What I learned really is the point I made earlier, which is that they are victims themselves of the American sort of system, if you like. They're not, you know, many of them were friendly towards me because they are deeply delusional. I mean, they deeply believe what they think. I mean, it's not just sort of a passing political passion or a white supremacist worldview alone. I mean, they genuinely believe that the American system is deeply corrupt. I mean, some of the people I was with broke into Congress and immediately asked the question, where are the pedophiles? I mean, they believed there are pedophile rings within Congress and that they were there to expose it. They believed deeply that November the 3rd was stolen. And so, you know, we need to ask ourselves, if we thought, suppose November the 3rd had been stolen as a massive fraud, would the insurrection then have been, you know, something to, you know, deplore, or would it have been justified? I mean, because they breached Congress believing deeply that November the 3rd had, you know, was a stolen election. They believed deeply that there was corruption that they were exposing. I mean, it may seem bizarre to us, but that is the basis of what was fueling the anger and the passion of the crowd. And so, you know, we have to deal with the root causes and examine as journalists the root causes of January the 6th, which is these incredibly toxic conspiracy theories that are ricocheting around the sort of darker side of the web and talk radio and right-wing media, and try and deal with it because it's out there and it's very dangerous.
Thank you. Absolutely, and again, it's not completely clear how. You know, it needs to be done, but we're trying to figure this out. The question from Adele Santella, who's in Brazil, and you talked about what you would do different. You know, that there are certain things you do differently, and I wanted to ask you about that as well. But she's saying, you know, the real concerns that in Brazil something similar might happen next year in case Bolsonaro doesn't win the presidential elections and refuses to accept the result. What advice would you give for the media to avoid the situations that led to January the 6th in polarized countries?
Yeah, it's a good question because, you know, almost every country is polarized now, isn't it? And I'm sure that the Trump agenda of sort of denying reality is going to be a template going forward for, you know, would-be authoritarian leaders who refuse to accept the result of democratic elections. I mean, I think I'm not sure I'm, you know, self-important enough to give advice to, you know, people like you valiantly reporting in countries like Brazil and many other troubled democracies, including the United States. But the value of news gathering and of listening before events unfold seems to me incredibly important because, you know, we can be kind of, you know, even if we're not passing judgment, we can be a kind of a warning signal of what's going on in communities that are under severe kind of political stress. And I think that was underreported in America, as I've explained, and perhaps it's underreported everywhere. You know, what is fueling these grievances? Why are people feeling unheard? Why are populists around the world able to kind of exploit these grievances and this sort of sense of anger? So I think, you know, we go back to basics in our business and we news gather and we listen. And I think in effect, that allows people to sort of see the fault lines and to discuss it around their kitchen table and to work out, you know, which is the best political path forward. But I think the worst thing to do is sit in a studio and debate something. I think it's really important we get out there, listen to people, understand what's fueling the grievance in the first place and investigate it and hold people to account. You know, constantly asking, you know, if somebody is, disputing an election outcome, you know, why is that? What is their motive? And what is fueling the kind of the populist discontent that they're so manipulatively exploiting?
Thank you. Question from Rachel, who is from India and works for the Times of India, wanted to ask if the Capitol riot, during the riot, where the rioters took videos of themselves in action, basically because they felt they could get away with it, or was it ignorance of the law, or was it just because they were caught up in the moment? Because in the Delhi riots in February 2020, rioters were filming themselves in action, and 50 people were killed, so they were essentially incriminating themselves.
Yeah, excellent question, Rachel. Yeah, one of the sort of paradoxes of it is, while we were the only kind of professional TV crew kind of with the mob at the time, we were actually surrounded by hundreds of cameras, or rather phones, because everybody was live streaming in real time on their sort of Facebook page the events. And what that told me was that it's been confirmed in interviews I've done since, is nobody has any sense of being sort of regretful or remorseful about that. They're proud of it. I mean, essentially, the insurrectionists of January the 6th are proud of what they did because they believe they were fighting a just cause. So, the view that this was a group which has been, perpetrated by liberal press outlets in America, this was simply and nothing more than a bunch of domestic terrorists, misses the point just as much as the sort of far right support of the insurrectionists. I mean, they were not universally domestic terrorists. Some of them were simply vulnerable and delusional individuals who'd been caught up in this web of lies. And part of the story of why that was is you could see it because they were, exactly as you say, Rachel, they were filming themselves, they were incriminating themselves. I mean, our video has been pursued by the FBI, and they've, various judges have asked us to see our videos so that they can help prosecute some of the people we filmed. But also in many court cases are the video of the people who actually filmed themselves, racing into Speaker Nancy Pelosi's office. So, they were filming their own, as you rightly point out, they were filming and incriminating themselves in real time. So, what a bizarre nature of the sort of the media, that they are filming themselves, actually providing prosecutors with the very evidence that will put them behind bars.
So we talked about the fact that everyone is filming themselves and broadcasting live, and you are broadcasting live, but there are these crucial moments where you have to pause and get back to the studio and edit. And as you said, you missed some crucial footage, the kind of footage of someone with their feet up on Nancy Pelosi's office. Would you do it differently? Could you make a case of saying, in a breaking news scenario, we need to just air what we've got instantly via our mobile phones or via our digital cameras?
Yeah, so that's a good question. If we could have live broadcasted, would we have done
Yes.
so? I think the answer is, truthfully, yes, we would have done so. But then, at ITV News, we've got the benefit of being able to not live stream news, but curate news, and therefore actually kind of produce a slightly more thoughtful television package with a bit of context. So, although that was a fly on the wall report, I also try to introduce some little bits of sort of navigation commentary for viewers, so they knew where we were, the significance of what was unfolding, and the nature of the moment. Because we're not live bloggers, we are broadcast television journalists. So we're not trying to put out stuff that is not curated to some degree. We're not trying to pass judgment, but we are trying to make sure that our reporting is put in to some sort of context that is meaningful for viewers. So sure, I mean that is a sort of as a trait of ITV News in a way, is we're not live broadcasters like some of our competitors are, but we are trying to produce a sort of thoughtful bulletin at the end of the day that isn't trying to pass judgment, but that is providing context. And that perhaps distinguishes us from the sort of live bloggers who are at the scene.
But it's also not the direction of travel of the news consumption. Younger people are not watching carefully curated programs on the evening news. They are logging in and seeing what's happening live, and then not following it up with, with their time with you.
Exactly. Now that's a valuable point and an observation about the sort of nature of news consumption for a younger generation that is an important one for institutes like yours to think about and to analyze, and perhaps to give us feedback about how we can do that. Because if people are just looking at 15-second TikToks of a news event, on their TikTok feed or on their Facebook feed, then how do we make sure that news is curated, not in a judgmental way, but in a way that gives people appropriate context so they understand what's going on. Because we looked at some of the sort of Facebook live streams from the day, and the sort of heady atmosphere of the insurrectionists, you might, easily think that, this was a legitimate political protest, not a storming of Congress. So yeah, it's a good question, no easy answers. It's that old conundrum of sort of, the attention span of young viewers, the algorithms of social media that's constantly sending us conspiracy theories if we show any curiosity in that direction, and the danger of partisanship on panels in television news. So in a way, Mira, what we're looking at is a sort of perfect storm, isn't it, of how we cover the fault lines in democracy and how we cover a populist movement like we saw in the Trump era. How do we do it when we've got big tech on one side with its algorithms, we've got the attention span of young television viewers on the other, and we've got wild partisanship even entering the mainstream of the American media landscape. So it's extremely massive challenge, and it's why we need people thinking about this, in your cerebral terms, as well as kind of doing it on the front lines, like I was trying to do. So the value of institutes and of webinars and seminars is very real. I mean, it's really important that we have these debates, even as, even to help inform those of us on the front lines about how we can do things better.
Yeah, no, it's thank you for that. I mean, it's what you're talking about really. I think there's always been a sense with broadcasters and kind of national TV that this is an essential part of democracy, and being a well-informed citizen requires being willing to spend some time consuming professionally produced news and absorbing the information and then making decisions based on the information you've absorbed. And there's a question from Donna Rockwell, who was a producer for CNN in the 1980s for Daniel Shaw. And she's saying she's concerned people don't grasp the importance of the fourth estate anymore. So they don't kind of grasp the importance of much of kind of established media. And how do you reinsure citizenship to people who understand the relevance of what we do? So how do you kind of say, this is why we're important? Is this something you kind of, is this something you can feed into your work, or is this something you just think about, occasionally when you're trying to think of formats?
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? And particularly when, the cheerleader in chief for hating the media is the president of the United States, and his, nurturing of the sort of fake news tagline that was designed to sort of toxify even the most established and reputable media outlets like New York Times or Washington Post. So it's not easy. I mean, I suppose what we can do is make sure that we listen to people, that there isn't a segment of the population that there is in the United States that feels essentially abandoned. I mean, Rust Belt America, the heartland of America, I think had very legitimate views that their sort of broken towns, their broken communities were underreported. And I think they're absolutely right to feel that. If you look at the sort of the events that were coursing through their communities for the last 10 years, an opioid addiction crisis, homelessness on a horrendous scale, levels of child poverty, a health insurance crisis, who reported those adequately? And so what we had was, what has been called by other sort of media academics a news desert, where local newspapers were being closed. In many counties in America, there is only one surviving local newspaper, so there's no media competition. Many of the newspapers in America are now owned, have been bought and owned by kind of financiers, so they have no sort of journalistic DNA in their blood. And so there is a real danger of the sort of heartland of America being underreported and even misreported. And so when people wake up and they're you know, they've got addiction crises besieging their communities. There's homelessness evident everywhere in America, and no one's reporting on it. You know, are they not right to feel aggrieved that we're misreporting and underreporting? So my answer about how to make sure that the media is recognized as an important part of the kind of community is let's report it. I mean, that really is my core point, is let's not talk about, you know, the crisis in the Midwest, you know, or in Rust Belt America. Let's be there. Let's not close our, you know, foreign bureaus or domestic bureaus. Let's expand them. Let's be counterintuitive and do more reporting, not less reporting, more, you know, frontline work, not more analysis. And I think that for me was the failure of January the 6th, but it's also an important warning about how in America they can sort of improve their television news coverage. It's ever more important when the newspaper industry is dying in the heartland of America.
Show me, don't tell me. Perfect journalism. Running out of time, I just have a question about white supremacists and reporting on white supremacists. You said that the most effective question is why, and you're absolutely right, because I was surprised how eloquent some of the answers were. You know, they were passionate and said in the heat of the moment, but were poetic and very well constructed sentences, you know, delivered coherently. But there is also then a question of how much credence do you put as a broadcaster to allowing people to air views that are clearly kind of abhorrent or hateful to other communities. So if you are interviewing white supremacists, or if any of the insurrectionists did agree to give an interview with you 6 months later, what are your views on how these views should be broadcast and aired?
Yeah, I mean, again, as you'd expect in a webinar of this caliber, superb questions and no easy answers. So look, you know, I'm not a magician. The debate about how to interview people with intolerable extreme views is a good one.
How have you been doing it?
Yeah, so I've been talking to the insurrectionists of January the 6th, some of whom are white supremacists and have far-right leanings, but as I've explained revealingly, many are not. Many are simply, I regard them as victims. A remarkable number of them, actually. I mean, I'm no psychologist, I'm not a therapist, but a remarkable number of them have suffered terrible trauma in their lives, often childhood traumas. Once you start delving into their inner lives, it's very disturbing what some of them have been through. I mean, I think as journalists, when we hear extreme and intolerant views, the key thing is to challenge it and to be seen to be challenging, not to accept it, not to be broadcasting it as sort of palatable. So, you know, I was speaking to Josh Pruitt, for example, who was a Proud Boy who was there on January the 6th in the heart of the action. And we sat down and I, you know, tried to tackle head on the issue of who are the Proud Boys? Where does their sort of misogynistic, nationalist, and nativist sort of ideological heritage come from? And then when he started explaining things, to challenge him at every point and turn, so that it wasn't sort of just propaganda, right-wing, far-right propaganda. So I think, you know, it's important to listen to these people. We can't ignore it because they're out there. They're a part of the American political constituency to a disturbing degree, for sure. But I think we need to report on it, but to challenge it at every twist and turn as they take us down their sort of far-right, extreme and hateful rabbit holes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I think we're going to be running out of time in a few minutes. I'll end there. It's been utterly, it's been a compelling hour, and it kind of highlights more than ever the importance of having reporters on the ground reporting. Actually, I did have one very good last question from Alistair Brandon, which I was wondering all the way through. Was your entry into the Capitol technically illegal as well? Could you have gotten into trouble?
Excellent question. Well, I've got the ultimate defense of, you know, what a famous congressman called being in good trouble. So in other words, you know, sure, it was illegal. Sure, I could probably be arrested. But look, I'm going to claim that as journalists, you know, we've got a higher motive, and it's important that we follow events wherever they take us. So sure, I've kind of wondered if I might get a knock on the door from the FBI one day, but I'm happy to fight that battle in court. And my final contribution, Mira, would be this really is, sure, it's important we news gather, but it's also important that people like you and those on this webinar continue to think about these bigger issues. because, you know, on the front lines, we're not doing enough thinking. And these are the sort of questions that you know, your panel and your contributors have asked me today are incredibly important. So I would just say there's a really important role for the sort of journalistic academic community as well, to think through how we cover a populist movement, to think how we deal with the sort of conspiracy theories and how we deal with the algorithms of big tech, how we interview, you know, far right white supremacists without giving them too much of a platform. I mean, these are big issues. And I think it's important to understand that those of us who are reporting don't have the answers. So we look to, you know, institutes and to academics to try and help us be our sort of navigating tools to think deeply about the fundamental issues. So it's great that we've had this, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to chat about it. But I've also learned a lot as well as having spoken a bit about this.
Absolute pleasure, and you've handed me the perfect lead into what I was going to say next, which is that we run a journalist fellowship program at the Reuters Institute, which is precisely to do this, to allow journalists to step away from the front line, come join us and think about reporting and think about how they will face these challenges and answer these questions, and also crucially learn from each other. We have a very global journalist fellowship program with journalists from all around the world, and what's really clear is that authoritarian leaders are learning from each other much faster than journalists are learning from each other. And it's kind of important that we share resources, but also share knowledge and share experiences, both in public seminars like this, but also in closed discussion groups. And journalists are coming under attack in whole new ways that we never imagined possible even a few years ago, online, in person, in crowds, in their newsrooms. So being able to get these journalists to the Reuters Institute to join our fellowship program and participate and then go back into their industries, refreshed and with strength, is really, really important. We do have a fund that is aimed at getting more journalists from difficult conditions to the Reuters Institute. Please do give if you can. Everything we do with these global journalism seminars is free to air and will continue to be. But if you have been watching and listening to the messages, I think you'll see how important it is to be part of this community of global journalists. So please do give whatever amount you can. There'll be a link up in the screen afterwards and in the chat function. And in the meantime, thank you so much, Robert, for this conversation. This is the last one.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And this is the last one of the term, and we will be back in the autumn with a whole new series. And thank you all so much for listening. And thanks again, Robert. I hope you get some coffee now from your very early morning stuff.